He wasn't born a hero. He was built to be a weapon, trained, broken, programmed to survive whatever hell the world threw at him. Forgotten by the very hands that created him, he should have vanished into the dust. But fate had other plans. In the shadow of betrayal and silence, a bond would be forged, stronger than any command ever given. This is the story of a soul they tried to erase, and the journey he chose for himself. If you believe loyalty can be stronger than blood, if you believe the past can be rewritten, you're in the right place. Tap like, hit subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, and what moment already has your heart locked in. Dust spun in lazy spirals beneath the slanted beams of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the weathered auction barn. Malik Hayes adjusted the collar of his battered leather jacket and squinted into the chaos ahead. The air was thick with the smell of livestock, sweat, and hay, underscored by the sharp metallic clang of pens swinging open and the restless grunts of cattle. Montana's late autumn chill gnawed at the edges of his worn boots, but Malik didn't move. His hands were buried deep in his pockets, fists clenched, heart drumming slow and heavy against his ribs. He wasn't here for cattle. He wasn't here for anything anyone else came for. He didn't even know what had pulled him off the remote backroads and into this town he hadn't set foot in since before the uniform, before the sandstorms, before the world went dark. At the far end of the dusty arena, the auctioneer's voice rang out, crisp and detached, listing off weights and bloodlines like they were features on a second-hand truck. Buyers waved paddles lazily, their faces bored, detached, more concerned with price per pound than the lives shifting and breathing in the pens. Malik's eyes drifted over the crowd, their faces blurring together until something different, something wrong, cut through the noise. The barking. No, not barking, a single, low, guttural growl, thick with warning but choked back like an apology. He turned. The dog came into view then, limping through a side gate as out of place as Malik himself. A German shepherd, black and tan, filthy, ribs ghosting under patchy fur, a jagged scar bisecting one ear. His right hind leg dragged uselessly, leaving a mark through the dirt. Malik and the world narrowed, the auctioneer's chant fading into the background hum. The shepherd didn't look at anyone. He didn't bark, didn't cower, didn't beg. He simply stood, battered and trembling, the chain around his neck loose and rusted, hanging like the remnant of a life already abandoned. The auctioneer stumbled slightly in his cadence, hesitating over the lot number. A ripple of disinterest passed through the buyers. No hands lifted, no bids came. A few mutters floated, not worth feet. A silent, raw resilience that called to a place inside Malik he had long since tried to bury. The auctioneer, seeing no interest, lifted his gavel, ready to motion the handlers to drag the dog off. Probably to a back shed. Probably to a bullet. Malik's hand moved before his brain caught up. Silent, steady. It rose above the crowd, no shout, no hesitation. Just a hand commanding the moment. Heads turned. Whispers surged through the barn like prairie wind. Who the hell was that? Why him? Why for that dog? Malik didn't hear them. The auctioneer blinked once, then slammed the gavel down with an unceremonious thud. Sold, he called, voice cracking slightly. Malik moved through the crowd, feeling the weight of 100 curious, judgmental stares. He didn't care. He didn't care that his jacket smelled like road dust or that he hadn't shaved in days. He didn't care that somewhere deep inside, he felt more exposed right now than he ever had kneeling behind sandbags while mortars rained overhead. He only cared about the shepherd, standing there in the dirt, trembling but refusing to fall. When Malik reached him, he knelt low, careful not to reach out too fast. The shepherd lifted his head, muscles tensing under scarred skin. Malik didn't speak. He just rested an open hand, palm up, inches from the dog's chest. A silent offer, a promise. Seconds dragged by. Then the shepherd, with a slow, cautious motion, shifted forward. His broad, battered head lowered until it brushed against Malik's palm. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but Malik felt it like a thunderclap against his heart. The bond was forged in silence, not in words. Not in commands or leashes or contracts. In choice. In mutual recognition. Malik's exhaled slowly, allowing himself the first real breath he'd taken in what felt like years. Around them, the barn seemed to hold its breath. A woman nearby clutched her husband's arm tighter. A rancher scowled and shook his head, muttering something about wasting good money. Malik didn't hear them. He slipped a battered collar from his pocket, the only thing he'd managed to save from his old shepherd, long gone now, and fastened it gently around the new dog's neck. "You're not broken," Malik said under his breath, voice too soft for anyone but the shepherd to hear. "You're just not finished yet." The dog's tail, ragged and low, gave one tentative sweep. Malik rose to his feet, the shepherd, his dog now at his side. Together, they moved toward the battered pickup waiting outside the barn, leaving behind the murmurs, the judgments, and the hollow clang of the auctioneer's gavel. As they stepped into the fading light, Malik didn't look back. He didn't have to. Something inside him, the part that had never stopped bleeding, even when the wounds scabbed over, had recognized the shape of survival. In himself, in this battered shepherd. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the road. Maybe it was the beginning. He reached down once more, running his fingers lightly over the shepherd's battered head. "Name's Shadow," he said quietly. "Let's get out of here." Shadow lay curled by the hearth, his battered body half silhouetted by the firelight that flickered against the cabin's rough wooden walls. Outside, the Montana wind howled against the windows, sending a steady rattling through the old frames. Malik Hayes sat at the small kitchen table, his eyes not on the soup slowly cooling in front of him, but on the dog, watching with a soldier's quiet scrutiny. Something wasn't right. Shadow wasn't like any shelter rescue Malik had ever seen. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if each twitch of muscle or glance of his dark eyes served a tactical purpose. When the wind gusted harder and the front door creaked in its frame, Shadow's ears pricked instantly, his body lowering into a tense, low crouch, not panic, not fear, but readiness. His head swung toward the door in sharp, controlled movements, eyes narrowing. Malik leaned back slowly, his instincts waking up in a way he hadn't felt since the worst days of his deployments. That wasn't the way a normal dog reacted to a noise. That was how a soldier responded to an ambush. Malik set his spoon down silently and rose from his chair. He crossed the room without making a sound, testing the floorboards automatically for creaks, just as he had on countless patrols through enemy compounds. Shadow shifted his weight subtly, muscles rippling under scarred fur, mirroring Malik's own cautious movements. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't even loyalty yet. It was something else. Something deeper, older, instinct honed by necessity. As Malik moved to check the windows, he noticed Shadow moving too, circling wide, always placing himself between Malik and any point of possible entry. The dog's movements were mechanical, practiced, almost textbook. Malik's heart thudded once, heavy and slow, a memory surfacing unbidden. Canine handlers training dogs in Kabul, moving them through bombed-out streets, teaching them the language of survival in a world that wanted them dead. Shadow moved like one of those war dogs, not a pet, but a weapon. Sitting back down heavily at the table, Malik rubbed a hand over his jaw. Questions crowded his mind, too loud to ignore now. Who had trained this dog? What had they trained him for? And why had Shadow ended up abandoned, broken, and sold for scraps in a forgotten barn? Malik's gaze drifted again to the battered German shepherd, now settled but not relaxed, his body always facing the doors and windows, his paws placed precisely, like a soldier awaiting orders even in sleep. Malik pushed his plate away, appetite gone. He rose and walked toward the fireplace, sitting cross-legged nearby, keeping his movements slow, deliberate. After a moment, Shadow's eyes flicked toward him, evaluating. Malik extended a hand, palm up. Shadow's body remained tense for a heartbeat longer. Then, slowly, he stretched his head forward, allowing Malik to rest his hand lightly atop the rough fur between his ears. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something to build on. As Malik's hand moved over the dog's matted coat, he felt the bumps and ridges of old scars, the places where fur had never grown back properly. His fingers brushed along the dog's belly and paused. Something was there. Not a scar, not fur. Something hard, gently turning the dog onto his side. Shadow tensed but didn't resist. Carefully, Malik parted the fur and found it, a small rectangle of black plastic, taped flat against Shadow's skin, nearly invisible under the thick hair. Malik's breath caught. A USB drive, or what remained of one. The casing was cracked and the connector was bent at a dangerous angle. Whoever had attached it had gone to great lengths to hide it, and whoever Shadow had belonged to clearly hadn't intended for him to survive long enough for it to be discovered. Malik carefully peeled the device free, murmuring soft reassurances as he worked. Shadow whimpered once, low and soft, more from memory than pain. Malik tucked the broken USB into his jacket pocket, mind racing. What the hell kind of dog carried hidden intel on his body? And what was so important that someone would use a living creature as a courier? Malik looked back down at Shadow, who was staring at him now, ears twitching slightly, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Malik offered a crooked, tired smile. "You're full of surprises, partner," he muttered. The fire crackled, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor, and Malik sat back on his heels, staring into the flames. Somewhere out in the darkness, the answers waited. He knew without doubt that finding them would drag him deep into places he had sworn never to walk again. Places lined with old sins and buried names. But looking at Shadow, Malik knew he didn't have a choice. Whatever hell had chewed this dog up and spit him back out had also touched something in Malik's own battered soul. They were connected now, stitched together by scars and silence, and something more fierce and unfinished. He stood and crossed the room to his duffel bag, pulling out an ancient laptop that he hadn't used since the army days. He booted it up, the machine whirring and clicking in protest. As the screen flickered to life, Malik set the broken USB beside it, staring at it like it might explode. "Whatever's on here," Malik said aloud, voice low and grim, "it's not staying hidden anymore." Outside, the Montana night pressed heavy against the windows. Inside, in the flickering firelight, man and dog sat locked together in a silence that felt less like fear and more like the still breath before a storm. The fire had burned low, casting little more than a glow against the cracked floorboards of the cabin. Malik Hayes sat rigidly in front of the battered laptop, his hand hovering over the broken USB drive like it was a live grenade. Shadow slept near the hearth, but it was asleep only in name. Every few minutes, the dog's ears twitched toward unseen sounds, his body tensing and relaxing in restless waves. Malik inserted the device carefully, half expecting sparks or some explosion, but the laptop only coughed once and then blinked to life. Lines of corrupted code scrolled down the screen, an endless sea of gibberish interspersed with flashes of real data, dates, coordinates, operational designations. Malik leaned closer, his gut tightening. He recognized some of those designations, not from any public database, but from briefings he had sat through in windowless rooms overseas. Briefings stamped with blacked-out lines and classified headers. Programs that didn't officially exist. Programs whispered about in the back alleys of the military-industrial complex, where men like him were expendable assets, and dogs like Shadow were just another weapon system. Scrolling further, Malik found a file labeled Reclaimer K9. His stomach flipped. He opened it. Grainy footage played across the battered screen, showing German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois in dark, fenced-in compounds, being drilled not just for obedience but for tactical assault patterns, high-value extractions, biological hazard detection, and worse. The dogs weren't just trained. They were conditioned through fear, for Bappy's lung had been disconcerted, and worse. The dogs weren't just trained, they were conditioned through fear, detoriate. Malik's hand tightened into a fist against the edge of the table. This wasn't standard military canine work. This was something else entirely. These animals were being broken down and rebuilt into living weapons, pride of identity programmed to act on embedded triggers. He glanced over at Shadow, now stirring, his paws twitching in some dream Malik couldn't imagine. No wonder the dog moved the way he did. No wonder he reacted to every sound, every shadow like an ambush was coming. Shadow hadn't just been abused, he had been manufactured, turned into something not entirely animal anymore. Not entirely machine either. A survivor caught between worlds, just like Malik. The realization hit him harder than any shell shock ever had. He leaned back in the chair, the screen still glowing with its damning footage, and closed his eyes for a long moment. He had seen enough. Later, as Malik stoked the fire back to life and prepared to crash on the threadbare couch, Shadow stirred again, this time waking fully. Malik watched him carefully. The dog rose with slow, cautious movements, ears flickering toward the door, the window, the dark corners of the cabin. When Malik dropped a spoon into the sink with a sharp metallic clang, Shadow's entire body stiffened violently, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from deep in his chest. He whipped around, positioning himself between Malik and the unseen threat, his breathing rapid and shallow. Malik froze. It wasn't the reaction of an ordinary abused dog. It wasn't a simple fear. It was textbook PTSD hypervigilance trigger responses, defensive posturing. Malik had seen it in his own squad mates, had felt it in his own marrow after too many patrols where death had waited around every corner. It was the same chemical storm raging under the skin, the same battle between instinct and rationality. Shadow wasn't just remembering trauma, he was reliving it. Malik knelt slowly, keeping his body language open and unthreatening. "Easy boy," he murmured, his voice low and even, the same tone he had used to pull younger soldiers out of their flashbacks in dusty tents a world away. Shadow hesitated, the conflict playing in his tense frame, then shuddered once and slumped forward, pressing his weight lightly against Malik's thigh. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of the world. Malik rested a hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the tremors vibrate under his palm. "Yeah," he whispered, I know what it's like." The connection between them wasn't one of rescuer and rescued anymore. It was one of survivors recognizing each other across the gulf of unspoken horrors. Through the night, Malik barely slept. Every time the wind whistled against the cabin, or a branch scraped across the roof, Shadow would jolt awake, eyes wild, body ready to fight or flee. Malik, stretched out on the couch, found himself mirroring the dog's tension, his own pulse quickening involuntarily, his own nightmares brushing close beneath the surface. In the dim, flickering light, it was hard to tell where one set of scars ended and the other began. At dawn, when the first pale light filtered through the trees, Malik made a decision. He pulled the laptop close again, reviewing the files with a renewed focus. If Shadow had been part of Reclaimer K9, then Malik needed to find out who had run it, who had buried it, and why a dog built for war had been discarded like broken equipment. Somewhere in the tangled mess of data were names, locations, maybe even faces, clues that could unravel the mystery not just of Shadow's past, but of Malik's own failures to save what mattered most. He scratched behind Shadow's ear, feeling the dog lean into the touch. "We're gonna find out the truth, buddy," he said softly, "whatever it costs." Shadow gazed at him with steady, haunted eyes that said more than words ever could. They were in this together now. Two ghosts moving through a world that had no place for them, tied together by loss, by survival, by a promise Malik hadn't even realized he was making until it was already carved into his bones. The fire crackled, the laptop hummed, and outside the cabin the wind carried the scent of rain and old buried things beginning to stir. Malik knew the road ahead would not offer peace. Not easily, maybe not ever, but, for the first time in a long time, he welcomed the storm. The rain had come sometime before dawn, a slow, cold drizzle that turned the dirt around the cabin into a slick, heavy mud. Malik Hayes stood at the window, coffee in hand, staring out into the mist that rolled like low smoke through the trees. Behind him, Shadow paced restlessly, his movements tight and easy, every muscle coiled as if waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. Malik couldn't blame him. Ever since the files had been opened, since the grim revelations about Reclaimer K9, it felt as if a weight hung over the cabin, thick and oppressive, a sense that the world beyond the tree line was no longer indifferent but actively hostile. Malik knew that feeling too well from long nights in hostile territory. It was the knowledge that they had been marked, that somewhere out there, something was coming. The knock came not on the door, but on the silence itself. A subtle shift, a disturbance so slight it might have been missed if not for the way Shadow's body froze mid-pace. Ears standing sharp, head swiveling toward the front door. Malik tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward the old revolver tucked under his jacket. He stepped to the window, careful not to situate himself against the glass, and peered into the gray. For a moment, there was nothing but mist and the slow dripping of water from the eaves. Then a shadow moved, a figure cloaked in rain gear, stepping lightly, deliberately toward the porch. Malik's blood ran cold. This wasn't some lost hiker or a neighbor come to call. This was a hunter, moving with precision, knowing exactly where he was going and why. Malik backed away from the window, moving low and fast across the room. "Stay close," he hissed to Shadow, but the dog was already moving, already positioning himself between Malik and the door. The knock came, not polite but two sharp raps, more like a signal than a request for entry. Malik said nothing. The figure outside shifted, reaching under his coat. Malik caught the glint of metal and acted without thought, flipping the heavy oak table onto its side as makeshift cover just as the first shot shattered the front window, spraying shards of glass and rain into the cabin. Shadow growled low, a sound so deep and primal it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A second shot tore through the doorframe, splintering wood, and Malik returned fire once. A warning shot, more to buy time than to kill. Outside, the figure ducked and shifted position. This was no amateur. Whoever he was, he knew how to move, how to press an assault. Shadow barked sharply, not in fear but with the clipped urgency of a trained alert. Malik knew he couldn't hold this position long. They were boxed in. And if the hunter had backup, and he probably did, they would be flanked within minutes. He needed to move, to reposition, but the moment he shifted, a third shot whined past his head. So close he felt the heat of it. They were pinned. Shadow made the decision for him. Without warning, the dog bolted toward the side door, slamming his shoulder against it once, twice, until the rotted latch gave way and the door swung open into the mist. Malik cursed under his breath but followed, keeping low, heart pounding. As he stumbled into the muddy clearing, he saw Shadow veer left, angling wide, cutting through the fog like a ghost. Malik followed the dog's lead, trusting that primal instinct that had kept them both alive this long. They made it 20 yards into the trees before Malik heard the crunch of boots behind them, the hunter giving chase. Shadow circled back suddenly, teeth bared, body low and lethal. When the hunter emerged from the mist, weapon raised, Shadow struck like a missile, launching his full weight into the man's side. The hunter grunted, staggered, tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Shadow was faster, savaging the man's gun arm with brutal efficiency. The pistol clattered to the ground. Malik didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, kicking the weapon out of reach and grabbing the hunter by the jacket, slamming him back against a tree with enough force to shake loose a rain of wet leaves. For a moment they grappled, slipping in the mud, fists and elbows and boots trading blows. The hunter was strong, but Malik fought with the desperation of a man who knew that losing meant more than death. It meant silence. It meant the past swallowing him whole. Shadow darted in and out, teeth flashing, disrupting the hunter's balance, giving Malik the opening he needed. With a final, bone-jarring, breathing hard, Malik backed off, the revolver leveled at the hunter's chest. Shadow stood bristling at his side, growling low, teeth bared in a snarl of pure warning. The hunter lay gasping in the mud, his face obscured by a soaked hood. Malik kicked it back, revealing a face lined with old scars and cold, merciless eyes. "Who sent you?" Malik demanded. The man only smiled, blood staining his logic. He rasped, retrieved. His gaze flicked to Shadow, and for the first time, Malik understood. This wasn't a random attack. They hadn't come for Malik, they had come for the dog. The hunter laughed once, a short, broken sound. "Property," he wheezed. "Asset. You think you can just walk away with him?" Malik's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could respond, the hunter's eyes shifted behind him. A silent signal. Malik spun instinctively, catching movement in the fog, more figures closing in fast. Shadow barked, lunging forward to intercept the nearest, and Malik fired twice into the mist, buying precious seconds. They couldn't stay, not here, not now. Grabbing Shadow's collar, Malik yanked him back and bolted deeper into the woods, heart hammering, breath burning in his lungs. Bullets ripped through the mist around them, chewing into trees, whistling past their heads. But they ran on, stumbling, slipping, driven by something older than fear. Malik didn't look back. He didn't have to. He could feel the storm closing in. The trees whipped past them in a blur of gray and green as Malik and Shadow tore through the forest, slipping and sliding over wet roots and loose rocks. The sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them but never disappearing entirely. Malik's breath burned in his throat, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. But he refused to slow down, refused to let the shadows creeping through the mist catch them. They ran until Malik's legs trembled and Shadow's flanks heaved, until the forest thinned and the ground beneath their feet hardened into the gravel of an abandoned logging road. Malik veered left without thinking, instinct guiding him, and spotted a crumbling ranger station tucked against the tree line, its windows boarded and its door hanging crooked. It would have to do. He shoved inside, dragging Shadow with him, and kicked the door closed behind them. For a long minute they stood there, chests heaving, listening. Only the sound of the rain dripping through the broken roof and the distant, muted curses of the hunters echoed in the damp air. They had lost them, for now. Malik collapsed against the wall, cradling his side where a branch had gouged a deep line through his jacket. Shadow paced restlessly, nose twitching, ears swiveling with each distant noise. Malik watched him, the raw electric tension vibrating off the dog, and knew that this wasn't over. He needed answers, needed to understand what kind of storm he had walked into. Pulling the battered laptop from his pack with trembling fingers, he booted it up again, the screen flickering weakly to life, the files from the broken USB still loaded, still humming with secrets. Malik dug deeper, clicking through corrupted folders until a new name surfaced, one that made his heart stutter painfully against his ribs. Calvin Drayton. The file was thin, deliberately scrubbed clean, but the pieces that remained were enough. Drayton had been a lieutenant colonel in a Black Ops unit that officially didn't exist, a unit tasked with unconventional warfare techniques, psychological conditioning, and biological asset development. The Reclaimer K9 program had been his pet project, an off-the-books experiment in creating not just military working dogs but living weapons, creatures trained to operate independently, to carry out missions even if their handlers were dead. Malik scrolled further. His jaw tightened. Drayton had vanished 5 years ago, just as the Reclaimer K9 program had been disavowed and buried under layers of classified red tape. No death certificate, no court-martial, no official record. He had simply disappeared, like smoke. Malik's hands shook slightly as he clicked through the last of the surviving documents, each line a jagged knife scraping against old, half-healed wounds. Mission reports, deployment schedules, casualty lists. And then he froze. A photo, grainy but unmistakable, snapped in some dusty outpost half a world away. A squad of soldiers, their faces young and hard, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a battered Humvee. And at their feet, sitting proudly despite a makeshift splint wrapped around his hind leg, was a young German shepherd, black and tan, eyes sharp and alive in a way that transcended the limitations of the photo. Shadow. Malik stared, breathless, as recognition thundered through him. He knew that squad, he knew those faces. They were his men, his unit, the ones he had led through fire and blood, the ones he had buried piece by piece over the course of a hellish 6-month deployment that had ended in betrayal, slaughter, and silence. He leaned closer, heart hammering. There he was himself, younger by years but with the same grim set to his mouth, one hand resting lightly on the dog's broad shoulders. Shadow had been theirs, not just another military asset, not some random K9 plucked from obscurity, but a member of Malik's own squad, trained alongside them, bled alongside them. He felt the world tilt slightly beneath him, a wave of vertigo threatening to drown him. How had he not recognized the dog at the auction? How had time and trauma and loss twisted the memories so badly that he hadn't seen what was standing right in front of him? Malik scrubbed a hand over his face, anger and guilt churning hot in his gut. Shadow had survived that nightmare too. Somehow, against all odds, against the program that had sought to use and discard him, Shadow had lived. Just like Malik, just like the broken fragments of a brotherhood that no one spoke of anymore. A legacy of blood and betrayal buried beneath the sand and the lies. Malik clicked on another file, fingers moving automatically now, driven by something deeper than reason. It was a mission log, incomplete but damning. It detailed the deployment where they had lost almost everything, the ambush in the village, the compromised intel, the sudden appearance of an enemy force too well informed, too well armed. The mission that had gutted Malik's soul. And there, buried in the debrief notes, was the reference: K9 Unit Reclaimer prototype deployed in field trial. High asset loss deemed acceptable. Malik tasted bile at the back of his throat. They had been test subjects, all of them. used as bait to measure the effectiveness of an experimental program. Shadow had been deployed not to save them but to observe, to report, to adapt. And when the blood ran too deep and the fires burned too hot, they had been abandoned, both man and dog alike. A sound snapped him back to the present, a soft scuff of boots on gravel outside the ruined ranger station. Malik slammed the laptop shut and grabbed the revolver, heart thundering anew. Shadow moved instantly to his side, body low, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Malik raised a hand, signaling for silence. The hand only regrouped. He edged toward the door, muscles coiled tight, every nerve screaming for action. The past wasn't finished with them yet, and neither were the ghosts stalking the mist. The rain tapered off into a mist that clung stubbornly to the trees, a cold, heavy breath that refused to lift as Malik Hayes pressed himself against the warped frame of the ranger station door. Revolver steady in his grip, Shadow crouched at his side, their breathing synchronized, silent, the tension thick between them, every instinct in Malik's battered body screaming to move, to escape, to find cover. But he forced himself to wait, to listen, and after a long, breathless moment, the faint crunch of retreating footsteps filtered through the mist. Not surrender, not yet, but a withdrawal, a regrouping, buying them a sliver of precious time. Malik exhaled slowly, the weapon lowering fractionally, his mind already racing. They couldn't stay pinned like rats. He needed information, plan, something more than blind flight. Turning back to the table, he yanked the laptop open again, fingers moving with grim purpose, and still flickering across the screen, the dusty remnants of the Reclaimer files. The battered photograph tucked in one corner of the mission archive, half-cropped and poorly scanned, but when Malik clicked it open, the world he had been holding at bay crashed down on him with brutal force. In the photograph, a younger Malik grinned lopsidedly at the camera, sunburnt and exhausted, one arm thrown protectively around a smaller, leaner German shepherd, black and tan, ears too large for his head, eyes bright with fierce, unbroken loyalty. Shadow, unmistakably Shadow, before the scars, before the weight of betrayal had hollowed them both out. Malik recoiled slightly, the air punched from his lungs, memory smashing into him like a wave, the endless days of patrols under a white-hot sun, the way the pup had clung to him, refusing to be left behind when the trucks rolled out, the endless hours Malik had spent training him, trusting him, loving him, and the night it had all gone to ruin, blood and fire and screaming, and then nothing, just ash and silence. Malik pressed his palms against his eyes, gritting his teeth against the raw ache that tore through him. He hadn't lost Shadow back then because he had lost him, because he had been taken, repurposed, turned into something else, while Malik had stumbled home half alive, convinced that everyone he had cared about was gone. The realization burned like acid in his gut, a betrayal layered deep enough that Malik thought he might be sick. But there was no time for grief, no time for rage, only action. Shadow bumped his muzzle against Malik's leg, a low whine vibrating in his chest. Not fear, not confusion, but urgency. And Malik understood instinctively. They weren't safe, not yet. Not until they dug deeper, found the root of this nightmare and ripped it out before it could claim them again. Squatting beside the duffel, Malik yanked out an old laminated map, the kind issued to patrol leaders back in the day, edges curled and stained, unfolded it across the dusty table. Shadow's nose immediately touched down on one corner, a low rumble vibrating in his throat. Malik leaned in, heart hammering. The spot Shadow indicated was a section of forest marked only with a faded grid reference and the innocuous label Maintenance Access B17, a designation that, to anyone else, would have meant nothing, but to Malik it screamed hidden facility, off-books infrastructure, the kind of place you buried experiments no one was supposed to find again. Without hesitation, Malik traced the route with his finger, memorizing the terrain, calculating distance and risk. Outside, the mist thickened. The hunters would be back soon, and next time they wouldn't just try to retrieve Shadow, they would make sure there were no witnesses left breathing. Malik shoved the laptop back into the bag, slung it over his shoulder, and signaled to Shadow, who fell into step instantly. No leash needed, no command spoken. They moved as one, slipping from the ruined station into the shelter of the trees, the cold seeping into their bones but unable to slow them down. The forest swallowed them in seconds, the world shrinking to the slap of wet leaves underfoot and the muffled roar of blood pounding in Malik's ears. The hike was grueling, the terrain rough and treacherous, Malik's boots sinking into mud, sliding over moss-slicked stones, branches clawing at his jacket, but they pressed on, Shadow leading unerringly, head low, movements sharp and deliberate, as if he could feel the pull of something buried deep in the earth, something old and poisonous that refused to stay dead. After nearly 2 hours of hard slog, they reached a clearing ringed with ancient pine, the ground sagging unnaturally in the center as if the forest itself recoiled from whatever lay beneath. Malik slowed, scanning the perimeter, the mist pooling thicker here, denser, the air colder, heavier, wrong. Shadow sniffed the ground, pale stiff, body rigid, and then he began to dig, paws tearing at the soft earth with frantic urgency. Malik dropped beside him, clawing at the dirt with bare hands until his fingers scraped against something hard, metal, corroded but unmistakable. A hatch, half buried and long forgotten, a rusted wheel lock seized with age. Malik heaved, the mechanism groaning in protest but eventually giving way with a shriek that split the heavy silence like a gunshot. The hatch yawned open, revealing a shaft of darkness that swallowed the meager daylight whole, the stench of old chemicals and decay rising like a breath from the underworld. Malik wiped the sweat and mud from his face, heart pounding, and glanced down at Shadow, who stood braced at the edge, eyes locked on the abyss below, unflinching. Malik nodded once, the decision already made. They would go down, into whatever nightmare had been left to rot here, because some ghosts you couldn't outrun. Together, they stepped into the blackness, the hatch creaking shut behind them with a sound that felt disturbingly final. The darkness swallowed them whole, the air in the shaft thick and rancid, each breath Malik Hayes drew scraping against his lungs like sandpaper. The narrow metal ladder groaning under their combined weight as he and Shadow descended deeper into the earth, the dim beam of Malik's flashlight cutting a feeble swath through the blackness, illuminating rusted pipes, dangling wires, and walls stained with water and time. When their boots finally hit solid ground, the silence was oppressive, a heavy, suffocating thing that seemed to press against Malik's skull from all sides. He swept the light in a slow arc, revealing a low corridor, the walls lined with cracked tiles and faded hazard signs. The air reeked of chemicals and rot. Shadow moved ahead, his body low and tense, his nose twitching as he read the ghostly imprints left behind by long-forgotten horrors. They moved in silence, each step deliberate, measured, Malik's heart pounding with the cold certainty that whatever secrets had been buried here were not entirely dead. As they progressed deeper into the underground warren, Malik noticed the subtle details that marked this place as something far worse than a mere abandoned facility. Old kennels lined the walls, heavy steel doors with small barred windows, the scent of fear and blood still lingering like a stain that no amount of time could wash away. Faded tags dangled from rusted hooks, numbers instead of names. Some of the doors still bore deep gouges, desperate claw marks etched into metal. Malik's stomach twisted, rage simmering low and hot in his gut. This had been a place of torment, of perverted science, where creatures like Shadow had been broken and reforged into something unnatural. They reached a larger chamber, the remnants of a control room, shattered monitors and overturned filing cabinets scattered across the floor. Malik rifled through the debris, pulling out a moldy clipboard, scanning the faded entries. The words hit him like a punch. Subject 1479. Cognitive independent combat adaptation successful, secondary conditioning applied. Field deployment authorized. 1479 Shadow's designation. They hadn't just trained him, they had engineered him, twisted his instincts, rewired his mind to serve purposes no living being should ever be forced to carry. And then they had thrown him away when he became inconvenient. A low growl snapped Malik's head up. Shadow stood rigid, hackles raised, eyes locked on the corridor they had come from. Malik spun, flashlight stabbing into the darkness. For a moment he saw nothing, then a flicker of movement, a shadow against shadow, far too large and fluid to be human. Malik's blood ran cold. They were not alone down here, and whatever was coming had been following them long before they descended into this place. The realization slammed into him with brutal clarity. This had never been a random pursuit. The ambush at the cabin, the hunter in the woods, even the encounter at the ranger station, they had been herded, driven toward this place like game animals into a killing field. Malik backed toward Shadow slowly, the revolver steady in his grip, breath shallow, the flashlight cutting frantic arcs across the ruined hallway. The soft sound of claws clicking against tile reached his ears. More than one set, fast, deliberate, coordinated. He caught a glimpse then, out of the corner of his eye, sleek bodies, low to the ground, moving with terrifying precision. German shepherds, 5, maybe 6 of them, eyes reflecting the glow stride's beam with an unnatural predatory glow. Their bodies leaner than normal, muscles wired too tight under mottled fur, their movements eerily synchronized. Malik's heart clenched painfully. They weren't just dogs. They were soldiers, bred and programmed for war, the same as Shadow. But where Shadow had fought free of his conditioning, these creatures had not. They were his brothers, his twisted reflections, and they had been sent to bring him back or to tear. The lead dog snarled, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the corridor like a death knell. And then they charged. Malik fired, the crack of the revolver deafening in the confined space. One of the dogs yelped and went down, but the others surged forward, unstoppable. Malik barely had time to react before they were upon him. Shadow leapt into the fray, a blur of teeth and fury, intercepting the first attacker mid-air, the two of them tumbling across the floor in a vicious, snarling knot. Malik fired again, hitting another dog in the shoulder. Slowing it but not stopping it, he backed toward the control room, searching desperately for cover, for anything that might even the odds. Shadow fought with a savage, terrifying grace, every move precise, economical, as if some buried instinct had taken over. Malik watched in horror and awe as his companion disabled one opponent, then pivoted smoothly to face the next. The enemy dogs fought like machines, no hesitation, no fear, just relentless, mindless aggression. Malik ducked as one lunged for his throat, slamming the revolver's butt into its skull, the impact jarring up his arm. The dog staggered but didn't fall. Malik kicked it away, heart hammering, blood roaring in his ears. They were losing ground. There were too many, too fast. A sharp bark from Shadow broke through the chaos. An order, not a plea. Malik turned in time to see the dog dart toward a side passage, pausing only to ensure Malik followed. Malik didn't hesitate. He ran, feet pounding the cracked tiles, Shadow close beside him, the enemy pack giving chase, their snarls and growls filling the narrow halls with a nightmarish cacophony. Malik stumbled through a rusted doorway into another corridor, this one narrower, choked with debris and hanging cables, the perfect place to bottleneck their pursuers if they were fast enough. Shadow skidded to a halt ahead, ears flat, nose working frantically. Malik caught up, chest heaving, and saw what had stopped the dog, another hatch set into the floor, newer than the others. Reinforced steel, slightly ajar. Malik didn't think. He dropped to his knees, wrenching the hatch open fully, the darkness below gaping like a hungry maw. A hard shove from Shadow propelled him forward, and Malik plunged into the void, the hatch slamming closed above them just as the first of the enemy dogs rounded the corner, their furious howls echoing in the dark. The fall jarred Malik Hayes to his bones, the impact knocking the air from his lungs as he crashed onto a floor littered with broken concrete and twisted rebar. Darkness pressing in from all sides. Shadow landed beside him with a grunt, rising instantly into a defensive crouch, the hatch above them rattling as the enemy dogs clawed futilely at the sealed metal. Malik forced himself upright, every muscle screaming in protest, sweeping his flashlight in a wide arc, the beam cutting through the blackness to reveal a vast underground chamber. The remnants of a forgotten laboratory sprawled before them, rows of shattered glass cages, rusted surgical tables, stains that no amount of time could erase. The air was thick with the ghosts of suffering, the walls practically vibrating with old screams. Shadow growled low, his body tense, his ears flattened against his skull. Malik caught movement at the far end of the room, a figure stepping out from the gloom, and for a heartbeat he thought it was another hunter, another soldier sent to drag them back into the shadows. But as the figure moved closer, Malik's blood froze. His body had already split as if nothing to make him Aresticate frighten. Larger than Shadow, built like a machine, muscle scars, his eyes glowed with a cold mechanical intelligence. and around his neck dangled a broken chain collar stamped with a number Malik recognized instantly, 1478, the one before Shadow. For a long moment, the two dogs stared at each other across the broken floor, the weight of recognition heavy between them. Shadow shifted, his body language complex, conflicted, a mixture of challenge and sorrow. Malik watched, heart hammering, understanding dawning with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just another asset, another reclaimer experiment. This was Shadow's brother, his literal program twin, molded from the same brutal hands but without the mercy of a second chance. And now they stood opposed, past and present colliding in a silence thick enough to choke. The black shepherd bared his teeth in a silent snarl and lunged. Shadow met him halfway, the impact a brutal clash of bodies and teeth. Malik shouted, but it was useless. This was a battle older than words, deeper than commands. They fought like mirror images, each move answered with a counter, each feint anticipated. The fight wasn't just physical, it was a war of wills, a clash of memories. The way he hesitated for a fraction of a second before delivering a crippling blow. The way he fought not to kill but to reach something buried deep inside his adversary. Something that might still remember what it meant to be free. Around them, the facility groaned and creaked, dust falling from the ceiling as the vibrations from their battle shook the crumbling foundations. Malik moved along the perimeter, searching for an advantage, for anything that could tip the odds. But he was slower now, fatigue and blood loss catching up with him, his vision swimming, his steps unsteady. A gunshot cracked through the cavern, a hot lance of pain tearing across his ribs. He staggered, the flashlight spinning from his grasp, plunging the world into deeper shadow. Malik hit the ground hard, tasting blood, his revolver skidding out of reach. From the corner of his eye he saw the shooter, another mercenary, slipping from the shadows. Rifle raised for a killing shot. Malik cursed and tried to roll, tried to reach the weapon, but his body refused to obey, pain pinning him in place. He was exposed, vulnerable, death looming close and inevitable. But before the gunman could fire again, a blur of fur and fury slammed into him. Shadow, battered and bleeding. Pantomime massacre, filth. The black shepherd howled in frustration but didn't pursue, standing rigid, muscles trembling with the conflict raging inside him. Shadow tore into the mercenary with brutal efficiency, driving him back into the wall with a wet crunch. Malik dragged himself upright with agonizing slowness, pressing a hand to the wound at his side. Warm blood seeping between his fingers, he stumbled toward Shadow, who stood protectively over the fallen man. Sides heaving, blood matting his coat in dark patches. Malik met his gaze, the silent question passing between them, "Can you still move?" And Shadow, ever the soldier, the brother, gave a sharp, almost defiant bark. Malik staggered forward, grabbing the rifle from the dead mercenary, checking the chamber out of habit. They couldn't stay here, the fight wasn't over. Around them, the facility trembled as if the earth itself were rejecting the horrors buried in its veins. A low rumble building somewhere deep beneath their feet. Malik slung the rifle over his shoulder and clutched at Shadow's scruff for support. The dog braced himself under the weight, steadying Malik with the same fierce determination that had carried them through deserts and kill zones long ago. Together they limped toward the far side of the chamber, the black shepherd watching from the shadows, unmoving, the battle unfinished but paused, as if even he sensed that the true fight was yet to come. Malik's vision blurred again, the edges of the world going soft and gray, but he forced his body forward, driven by something older than pain, older than fear, a promise made in blood and loyalty. And Malik snapped back to focus just in time to see another figure stepping from the smoke. A figure he recognized instantly, a ghost in the flesh, a man he had once trusted. Malik Hayes blinked through the haze of smoke and blood, trying to focus on the figure emerging from the shadows. The tall, lean frame wrapped in a rain-soaked tactical jacket, the face older now, more worn but unmistakable. Calvin Drayton, the architect of the Reclaimer K9 project, the man who had built an empire of blood and silence, and then vanished when it cursed it. The man Malik had cursed in 100 nightmares. He wasn't dead. He wasn't hiding, he was here, alive and moving through the wreckage of his sins like a king surveying a fallen kingdom. Malik tightened his grip on the stolen rifle, ignoring the searing pain along his ribs. Shadow bristled at his side, a low snarl building deep in his chest, Drayton's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, something cold and predatory. Hayes, he knew. You never could leave well enough alone, Hayes, he said. His voice low, almost conversational. Should have stayed buried with the others. Malik said nothing, breathing hard. His mind racing, Drayton glanced at Shadow. The faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. Malik saw the calculation there. The weighing of assets and liabilities. Drayton took a slow step forward, hands raised casually. This could have been simple, he continued. But you had to dig, had to drag the past into the light. You don't understand, Hayes, you never did. We're building something here. Malik's finger twitched against the trigger. The old training warring with raw, furious instinct. Drayton tilted his head slightly. Like a man studying a puzzle he found amusing. This facility, he gestured around at the crumbling ruin, was just phase 1, the prototype. A rough draft, the real work, the true reclaimers are already being shaped just a few miles from here. Deep in the timberline, no oversight, no rules, no limits. We learned from our mistakes, Hayes. You should be proud. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain. Malik's vision narrowed, a red haze creeping at the edges. Shadow tensed beside him, vibrating with barely restrained fury. Malik forced his voice steady. You're breeding killers, he spat, programming them to die for you just like before. Drayton's smile widened slightly, a flicker of genuine pride in his eyes. Not killers, survivors, soldiers designed for the wars to come. Obedient, fearless. Malik wanted to put a bullet between his eyes, wanted to end it right there. But another voice screamed inside him. Warning, not yet, not like this, not without proof, not without bringing the whole rotten structure crashing down. The ground trembled slightly underfoot, the old facility groaning in protest as the fires from their earlier battle spread unchecked. Somewhere above them, the hunters regrouped, barking orders. Malik's time was running out. Drayton must have sensed it too, because he gave a short, mocking salute and melted back into the smoke, disappearing with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime slipping through cracks. Body taut, they followed the faint traces of Drayton's retreat through the collapsing corridors, deeper into the forgotten bowels of the complex. They stumbled into what must have once been a records room. Filing cabinets rusted into skeletal frames, mold-eaten folders scattered across the floor like the remains of a battlefield. Malik's light caught a heavy steel locker half buried under debris, its door wrenched partially open. Shadow sniffed it once, then barked sharply. Malik dropped to his knees, fingers clawing through the wreckage. Inside the locker were sealed waterproof containers, cracked but still intact. He pried one open and froze. Inside were files, photos, rosters, lists of names and numbers, experimental logs, project proposals. Everything. The true heart of the Reclaimer program laid bare. A ledger of sins written in blood and silence. Malik rifled through the files. Heart hammering, he saw names he recognized. Men and women he had served with, dogs he had trained beside, all listed as assets, test subjects, disposable variables. He saw deployment orders stamped with Drayton's signature, authorization memos from blacked-out agencies, proof of what they had all suspected but never dared to speak aloud. Shadow stood guard at the doorway, muscles twitching, ears flicking at every distant sound. Malik stuffed as much of the evidence as he could into his duffel, cramming files and hard drives and battered disks into the worn canvas bag. The facility shook again, more violently this time, dust cascading from the ceiling in thick sheets. Somewhere pipes burst with shrieks of tortured metal. Malik knew they had minutes at best before the whole structure came down on top of them. He shouldered the bag, wincing at the fresh burst of pain from his wound, and turned toward Shadow, who met his gaze steadily, ready, wading through the crumbling ruins, the heat from the spreading fires licking at their backs, the enemy dogs' snarls echoing faintly through the vents. They burst through a side door into a tunnel half canapped with debris, Malik's legs nearly giving out as he stumbled over fallen beams and cracked concrete. Shadow stayed close, pressing against his side, anchoring him, lending strength he didn't know he still possessed. Every step was a battle, every breath a razor drawn across his ribs. But they kept moving, driven by something more than survival, driven by the need to finish this, to drag the truth out into the light no matter the cost. Ahead, the tunnel narrowed, a shaft of pale light spilling through a jagged rent in the wall. An exit, Salvation balanced precariously against the inevitable collapse. Malik pushed harder, the bag of evidence thudding against his back with every step, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them, snarls and shouts and the rhythmic thud of boots against broken stone. He risked a glance back and saw shapes moving through the smoke, hunters and hounds alike, closing fast. Shadow snarled, snapping at the air, urging him on. Malik gritted his teeth and surged forward. The exit just within reach, the promise of air and sky, and one last shot at justice burning bright ahead. The world exploded behind them as Malik, Hayes, and Shadow burst through the jagged hole in the wall, the collapsing facility vomiting fire and dust into the sky, the concussion wave lifting them off their feet and slamming them into the wet earth. Malik rolled instinctively, clutching the duffel bag tight against his chest. Shadow landed hard, but was up in an instant, circling back to cover Malik with his battered body. For a long moment there was only the roar of destruction, the rain hissing against burning rubble, the distant shouts of hunters scattered in confusion. Malik coughed and forced himself upright, the evidence bag still miraculously intact, the names, the files, the truth they had fought and bled for cradled against his ribs like something holy. He staggered to his feet, every inch of his body screaming, but he didn't stop, didn't dare stop. Together he and Shadow limped into the forest, swallowed by the mist and the falling ash. It took 3 days of moving by night, hiding by day, of stitching wounds with trembling fingers and scavenging rainwater to keep themselves alive, but they made it, emerging battered and filthy into the outskirts of Bozeman under a gray, weeping sky. Malik didn't go to the hospital, didn't go to the police station. He went straight to Deputy Marshal Lance Dwyer, slamming the duffel down on the battered desk without a word. Dwyer opened it, eyes widening as he flipped through the files, the photos, the manifests. Malik said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of the evidence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Arrests followed, raids and subpoenas and headlines that tore through the sleepy town like a wildfire. Drayton's network collapsed almost overnight. What survivors remained of the Reclaimer program were recovered, some broken beyond saving, others still fighting to trust that freedom wasn't just another cage. Offers came, of course, suits in clean government cars with clipped voices and empty promises. They wanted Shadow, wanted to study him, to dissect the miracle of his survival. Malik listened in silence and then told them to go to hell. He hadn't dragged Shadow out of that nightmare just to hand him over to another kind of leash. He and Shadow had bled together. Forget about the money, wasn't about to betray that bond, not for medals, not for money, not for anything. Instead, Malik used what little compensation he received, along with the quiet donations from others who understood, to buy a piece of land just outside Livingston, rough and wild and perfect. The sanctuary rose from the dirt like something old being reborn. Low wooden buildings with wide porches, open fields fenced by sturdy rails, a training yard overgrown with grass and dandelions where no one ever raised a hand in anger. No chains, no shock collars, only open skies and the slow, patient work of rebuilding broken souls. Dogs arrived one by one, some limping, some snarling, some so hollowed out by fear that they barely remembered how to breathe. Malik welcomed them all, each with a touch, a word, a promise that no one would hurt them here, no one would ever use them again. Shadow became the first guardian of the sanctuary, a living symbol of survival and defiance. He patrolled the grounds with slow, measured steps, watching over the newcomers, sometimes guiding them with a nudge or a bark, sometimes simply standing near when they were too afraid to move. It wasn't command, it wasn't dominance. It was understanding, a bridge built from shared pain and quiet resilience. He had been created to be a weapon, molded to obey without question, but now he chose his purpose, and it was to protect, to heal, to remember. Malik built a cabin on the edge of the property, simple and sturdy, with a porch that looked out over the fields where the dogs ran free. Every morning he sat there with a mug of bitter coffee, watching the sun rise over the pines, Shadow always at his side. Sometimes when the wind was just right, Malik swore he could hear the echoes of the past, the ghosts of battlefields and burning villages. But they didn't haunt him anymore. They simply watched, bearing witness to a life rebuilt from ashes. Word spread slowly, as it always does, and soon the sanctuary wasn't just a refuge for the lost four-legged soldiers. It became a place where veterans found their way too. Men and women like Malik, carrying scars that didn't show on skin, drawn by the quiet, by the understanding that here, broken wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Some stayed helping to train the dogs, repairing fences, cooking meals. Some just sat on the porch with Malik and Shadow, breathing in the healing silence. One evening, as the last light bled out of the sky, Malik stood at the gate and watched as a young boy, maybe 10 years old, climbed from an old pickup truck. His face wary, his small hands clenching and unclenching nervously. The boy's father, a vet himself, nodded once at Malik. Silent thanks heavy in the gesture. Malik opened the gate without a word, and from his post beneath the great oak tree, Shadow rose and padded forward. Showing nothing light for the first undeniable, the boy froze. Then, slowly, knelt and extended a trembling hand. Shadow sniffed it once, then pressed his head into the boy's chest. The boy crumpled against him, silently, and Malik felt something deep inside his own battered chest crack open. Something he hadn't dared believe in for a long time. Shadow stayed there, patient and immovable, a living monument to every soul that had been bruised and beaten and forgotten, standing guard at the gates of a new beginning, the scars on his body and in his soul not erased but worn proudly. Proof that survival was possible, that healing wasn't a myth but a choice made every single day. Malik leaned against the fence, arms crossed, the wind ruffling his hair. He looked at Shadow, at the sanctuary slowly taking shape against the dying light, and he knew, deep down in the marrow of his bones, that they had finally won. Not with bullets, not with vengeance, but with the simple, stubborn refusal to let pain have the last word. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us creating it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that cut straight to the heart. We would love to know what part of Malik and Shadow's journey hit you the hardest. Was there a moment you couldn't forget? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice matters here.